we are going to revisit the actual history of voting rights for both men and women. And you'll see that men weren't trying to hold women back, that men also didn't have the right to vote as women, that women had more of a privilege than a right because they didn't have the same obligations as men. And finally, we're going to see that women use their votes to harm men, to work against our best interest, not the other way around. Now, here's this town hall, which doesn't get very many views because of it's limp-wristed, right? It's over 2 years old and it doesn't have even 400 views yet. The reason is because guys are in such denial. These academics are in such denial that women are the enemy of men, that they think that they simply don't understand. And once the truth is brought out there, things will change, right? The ladies will say, "Oh, I understand now," right? Which is bullshit. But in any event, here we're going to look at the Chartists wanted equal rights for both sexes. Shows misogyny never existed. 1658. Okay, let's start about here.
Is morally justified when a government does not safeguard the natural rights of its people. Remember that when we get to the Reform Acts and their motivation. And finally, of course, there were the Chartists. Their 6-point charter was entirely about political representation of the common people in Parliament. The main policy of the Chartists was to achieve universal male suffrage. In their early days, they were so radical as to propose universal suffrage for both sexes.
Now, why? They were actually from the get-go. It wasn't like they went for the men and then decided to add women. It was the other way around. And the reason was they know that society is on the backs of men, not women. Women leech off society. They don't uphold it. And that's why they fought for men originally. They figured there was a greater chance of it happening.
But quickly retrenched on the grounds that votes for women was rather too great a stretch. In the end, of course, universal male suffrage was barely achieved much before that of women, as we shall see. And the Chartists themselves, like the Peterloo crowd, were of both sexes.
There you go. Both men and women were working for universal suffrage for both genders. So this bullshit about a patriarchy holding women down has always been a lie.
The Depression of 1841-42 led to a wave of strikes in which Chartist activists were in the forefront, and the demands for the Charter were included alongside economic demands.
There you go. Now, I want to get to the second point, right? Where only 4% of the men had the vote. There you go. Let's see. 2645. Let's get there. 2645. Yeah, right there.
This cause started only in this period, merely because it had not yet borne fruit. Recall that agitation for male suffrage had been intermittently pursued for centuries before the first progress was made in 1832. Jeremy Bentham had argued for female suffrage as early as 1817, when only 4% of adult men had the vote.
There you go. And what were those 4%? The wealthy guys. So this was a class issue, not a gender issue, guys. It was a class issue, right?
The MP Henry Hunt was another early advocate for the women's vote. After enactment of the 1832 Great Reform Act, Hunt argued that any woman who was single, a taxpayer, and met the same property criteria as applied to men should also be allowed to vote.
There you go.
And then, more famously, John Stuart Mill was elected MP for the City of Westminster in 1865 on a platform that included votes for women.
There you go. All those guys were pushing for it, right? But again, this is a class issue. Here it is. The aristocracy was against the working class, not men against women. 34-24. Here we go. Let's get up here. Get up here properly. Right about there.
Did bill after bill fail to gain assent? If there was so much support for women's suffrage, why was it so long in coming to fruition? Why did women have to wait another 48 years after the first attempt at a bill before any women got the vote? The prevailing popular narrative today does not address this paradox because it does not
It's not a paradox, dude. It's a lie.
recognize that there is one. The approved mythology refuses to acknowledge that there was a majority of male politicians in support of female suffrage from at least 1884, if not earlier. This, you see, would conflict with the appealingly simple story of a belligerent male hegemony withholding the vote from women out of sheer misogyny. There was, however, a male hegemony in operation. But its target was not women. Its target was the working class.
Then it wasn't a male hegemony, was it? It was a man and woman. The rich women didn't want the working people to have votes either. Matter of fact, the rich suffragettes, they were from the upper class, didn't want working women to have the vote. So it's not a male hegemony. I'm screwing that word up. So, dude, you were wrong. You were passing a lie along.
Why? The answer in the word is fear. John Stuart Mill asked, why is nearly the whole educated class united in uncompromising hostility to a purely democratic suffrage? And he answered his own question. It is because it would make the working class the sole power. Because in every constituency, the votes of that class would swamp and politically annihilate all of the members of the community taken together.
There you go. So this was a class struggle. And the wealthy women didn't want the working class men and women to have the vote either. You understand that? Now we'll get into this great post by Exercise Delicious, where he talked about the female vote was used to make sure men couldn't vote against the draft. The men who would have been conscripted, the ones whose bodily autonomy was in question, voted 73% against conscription. But to effectively curtail this, essentially all countries that practice democracy and with conscription include women into this, and they make up the vast majority of voters. Women voted in favor of conscription, of course, because they were never in any danger. And that moved the decision. I mention this because this is not new. Women are the fuel for war. They gain by war. Men lose at war. Women gain. Unless they're actually like destroyed. Like when London was bombed, there was actually a chance a woman might have died. But other than that, wars are something that men, their boys and husbands go off to suffer. With the idea if they win, they'll bring back goodies for the women. And you'll notice too, guys, that when conscription is being brought out for women, that's when women will get all up in arms and say, we got to vote this down. They vote 100% for it when only men have to suffer. and they vote 100% against it when they have to join us, right? The female vote has always been for status quo of war, right? Historically, women have been given the right to vote right around the end of World War One or World War Two. And this was done officially in a lot of cases, experts will say because of the Red Scare or the fear of rising communism. This is code speak for they were afraid that men wouldn't want to be conscripted, to be sent to die in war for the aristocracy. That is why they brought in the right to vote for women primarily. This is very likely from some of the literature you can look up on, and this is especially discussions during suffrage movements. A lot of the fear of communism rising is very closely tied to the fear of men wanting to not have to be conscripted. The gender neutralizing tone of communism or radical leftism obscures this somewhat, in my opinion. Here's a list of countries and when they brought in the right to vote for women. The synchronized timing further affirms this. Right? This is after World War One. When did World War One end? Wasn't it 1918, right? So you got all these PTSD, mentally brutalized vets coming in and saying, we don't want to have to go through this ever again. And they started voting, right? They started voting and saying, we don't want we don't want to be conscripted ever again. Right? And when did they get the vote, these women? Russia, 1917. Germany, 1918. Austria, 1918. 1918. See? Other than France, which was very late, it's all right after the First World War when the men were going to say, we're not going to get drafted anymore. That's why they brought the women in, because the women thought, hey, I love war. I never have to suffer, and I gain from it. Time to vote it in. Right? And notice women are actually very right wing, aren't they? Because they feared this radical left, the radical leftism, right? Women are conservatives. They vote for men in brutal gender roles each and every time. Now, politicians in Britain noting the potential of female coercive power prior to World War I. For each of these countries, there's literature sprawled across the web to give an idea of how women's opinions, shaming, and threat of social and sexual deselection has been used to coerce men into dying in war. Women are the warmongers. And yes, this includes the suffragettes. Note, for example, in the link provided that it mentions that after Vice Admiral Charles Penrose Fitzgerald apparently initiated the white feather movement with a small group of women, 30 strong. And the latter part is important, right? The movement quickly spread around the country. Do you hear that, guys? Hear that? Not all women. There were only 30 women, and then all of a sudden, all these other women started jumping on to send their boys to war. And gain notoriety in the press for their action. Women in various locations took it upon themselves to hand out white feathers in order to shame those men who were not fulfilling their civic duties and obligation. Notice these civic duties and these obligations don't belong to women. So they got to vote, but they don't have any of these obligations. So it's a privilege for them, not a right. The politicians noted the strength of pro-war nature of women. Yeah, the pro-war nature of women, of course, right? Now, I'll get a little further here. Now, this actually bolsters what I just claimed about women. Women kept Germany center when the men after the war were very strongly pro-left. It's men who are progressive. It's men who are left. The women are right wing. They're conservatives. They wanted to abolish the war apparatus, and women consistently thwarted that, keeping them moderate in the eyes of the establishment. Men in this time period are routinely called Bolsheviks, who want to abolish marriage, to return women to the public property, destroy the church, or that they were some other German word like Spartakisten or something, right? Because it says here, look, effectively men in, I can't pronounce that, uh, were sent to sign the armistice. Oh, he was a civilian politician. He was later murdered by right-wing nationalists for doing what the generals were too cowardly to do themselves. Germany lost the war. So it took a civilian politician to finally go and do what he had to do for the betterment of the country, right? And it was right-wing men who destroyed him. These were all ways to distance themselves away from the fact that their men simply didn't want war. This anti-war rhetoric continued after the surrender in countries like Germany, and their voices were promptly muffled, purposely, if not, or not if, sorry, this is hard to read, or not is up to yourselves to determine by the female vote. Sorry, that's, sorry, that exercise delicious. This is, you need an editor, my man. You need an editor. But in any event, I read what's important. What we're proving here is that there was no patriarchy holding women down. Uh, Men also didn't get the vote. Men wanted women to have the vote. Men didn't hold women to the same obligations as they do themselves. So it was a privilege, not a right. And women love war, and they're the right wingers. Now, here's a poem by E. Cummings, My Sweet Old Etc. And you'll notice this. What he does is he talks about war, and etc. is used to color out all the bullshit, right? And he mentions two groups of people. He mentions his aunt and his sister. So they're women, they don't have to war. And he mentions his father, who's too old to go to war. And those are the people demanding that he goes to war. My sweet old etc. Aunt Lucy during the recent war could, and what is more, did tell you just what everybody was fighting. Notice it's very clipped, right? It cuts out all the bullshit. For my sister, Isabel, created hundreds and hundreds of socks, not to mention flea-proof ear warmers, etc. Whiskers, etc. My mother hoped that, right? In other words, they were working to say, here, boys, go to war and die. My mother hoped that I would die, etc. That's the most important part. It doesn't matter what bullshit reasons they come up. Your mother wants you to die, right? Bravely, of course, my father used to become hoarse, talking about how it was a privilege, and if only if he could. In other words, it's a privilege, but he's just not allowed, right? That's why you need the draft, everyone, because men aren't allowed, right? Meanwhile, myself, etc., lay quietly in the deep mud, dreaming. See? Because Cummings knew what this was about, right? So I've covered everything I need to cover, and we're going to end it here.